Normal enzymatic action involves binding of the substrate to the active site of the enzyme, and that leads to the enzymatic action. But sometimes we can see that there can be inhibition of the enzyme action. Those inhibitions can be of three types. There can be competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, or there can be uncompetitive inhibition. So in case of competitive inhibition, what happens? You have the substrate present, the substrate of the enzyme is present, but a very similar looking another object comes and binds to the active site of the enzyme. A very similar looking another object which resembles its in its structure with the active site of the enzyme comes and binds and thus hinders the enzyme action. So this is the inhibitor, and hence this is preventing the substrate from binding. This is known as a competitive inhibition. An inhibitor comes, binds to the active site, makes the active site engaged, and hence the substrate fails to bind with the active site. The substrate has to compete with the inhibitor to bind with the enzyme. So this is competitive inhibition. Then comes something that is non-competitive inhibition. In non-competitive inhibition, the active site is open for binding. The active site is very much open for binding with the substrate. The substrate can jolly well come and can try to bind with the enzyme. But what happens? There's another substrate which or inhibitor itself comes and binds to the enzyme, and that leads to alteration in the active site of the enzyme. The inhibitor changes the active site in such a way that the active site fails to allow the substrate to bind. So the substrate comes but fails to bind and goes away due to binding of the inhibitor in a separate site. That is non-competitive, because the inhibitor and the substrate are not competing for the same active site over the enzyme. This is non-competitive. As the inhibitor is binding to another site, there is no competition. Then finally we come to the uncompetitive inhibition. In uncompetitive inhibition, the substrate is allowed to bind with the enzyme. The substrate comes and binds with the enzyme, but at the same point the inhibitor also binds with the enzyme substrate complex and inhibits the enzyme action. There's no problem with the binding. Rather, the inhibitor binds with the enzyme substrate complex. Binds to enzyme substrate complex. So these are the three types of inhibition that you can see in case of enzyme action.